to the fourth episode of Theology with Thaden. Today we'll be continuing our series on women in ministry by taking a look at women in ministry in the early church. And now some of you might be thinking, why does it matter what women in ministry did in the early church? Isn't the Bible the primary authority we should be looking to? And you're right, the Bible is the primary authority we should be looking to. But here's the thing. Sometimes the Bible can be really confusing on a particular topic and not very easy to understand. And women in ministry is arguably one of those topics. It's pretty complicated and not always simple to tell what the Bible is saying about women in ministry. And when that's the case, something we can do to get a better idea of what the Bible is saying is we can look at the traditions of the early church. Because if the Bible was saying something, then the people in the early church would have had a better chance of understanding what it was saying than we did. Because back in the day, the people in the early church lived in a similar culture and context to the people who wrote the Bible and the people who received Paul's letters. So we can conclude then that if a practice was practiced in the early church, it's likely, not necessarily absolutely true, but likely that that practice is recommended in the Bible. So with that, let's take a look at some women who served in ministry in the early church. So first of all, I just want to highlight the office of deacon again. This office we already saw a little bit about with Phoebe, who served as a deacon, and she's mentioned in Romans chapter 16. But other women served as deacons or deaconesses in the church too after Phoebe. Now, some of us are probably wondering, what is a deacon anyway? Because churches today don't always have deacons, and even if our churches do have deacons, they're not necessarily the same as the deacons in the early church. The deacon was essentially the host of the church. They were the caretaker of the house in which the congregation gathered, and then they would receive the congregation and discern the character and faith and virtue of each individual member of the congregation. So the deacons had a lot of responsibility in the early church, very, very important. They probably were also involved in administering communion and maybe also saying like liturgical prayers and reading the gospel and stuff like that in the early church. And we know for a fact from ancient writings that women often did serve as deacons. We have writings talking about the practices and responsibilities of deacons, and at times it notes that these responsibilities that it's talking about, like anointing a woman before her baptism, were only acceptable for a woman deaconess to perform. So we know from that that there were often women who served as deaconesses in the early church. And we also know that a lot of the women who served as deaconesses were widows. Their first husband had died, and instead of marrying again, they decided to give their lives to the church by being essentially a host for the congregation. Very honorable and very important in the early church. It's a little bit more unclear whether or not women served as priests in the early church, and the priestly role would be more directly connected with the administration of the sacraments, particularly the Eucharist. We're not 100% sure how many women served as priests and whether this practice was widespread and accepted or more rare and frowned upon. The only definite literature we have on women as priests is a letter from the Pope that dates to around 500 AD, in which the Pope is complaining that women served as priests, or so it seems. The letter's pretty unclear. So from that letter, we can conclude a couple things. First of all, we can conclude that there probably, not definitely, but probably were some women who served as priests in the early church. And we can also conclude that the practice probably wasn't universally accepted around 500 AD since the Pope is complaining about it. But nonetheless, the fact remains that in the early church, it's likely that there were women who served as priests. And finally, I just want to draw attention to women in ministry in the artwork of the early church. We have several surviving pieces of artwork and literature from the early church that demonstrate that women did indeed serve in active ministry capacities in the early church. This image I have up on the screen is the side of a reliquary that was discovered in Old St. Peter's Basilica. Actually, no, it wasn't discovered in Old St. Peter's Basilica, but the image on it is Old St. Peter's Basilica. And we know that because in 1940, the Vatican did a archaeological dig at the site of Old St. Peter's Basilica, and they found a building that was identical in every way to the building that is depicted on the side of this reliquary. A reliquary, by the way, is a box within which sacred artifacts like the bones of saints or apostles or other things like that would have been kept. And this box is significant because it includes both men and women in the altar area, which is that little area kind of in the center of the box where you have two people kind of leaning over an altar looking kind of thing. On the left side of this image, you have the men. So you have two men outside of the altar area and then one man inside of the altar area. And on the right, you have the women. Again, two outside the altar area and one inside the altar area. This is significant because there is a woman inside the altar area, which suggests that she is in some way leading the service or actively participating in the administration of the sacraments or something like that. Some people have suggested that maybe the man and the woman in the altar area are getting married, which seems reasonable at first, but if you actually look really closely at the woman on the right of the altar there, you see that she is holding in her hands this little cup or bowl sort of thing, which again it strongly suggests that she is administering the Eucharist to the congregants. So I think it's clear from this evidence we've looked at here, women as deacon, women as priests, and women in the artwork of the early church, that women did often serve in ministry in the early church, definitely as deacons, and probably also as priests based on the artwork and literature that we have on this topic. It's not 100% definite how active they were as priests, but we nonetheless see that women did serve in ministry in the early church, which strongly suggests that the Bible did not forbid that practice. Now, why did women stop serving in ministry in the early church? And what led up to that? Well, it really had to do with the legalization of Christianity under Emperor Constantine, and then a change in the organizational structure of the church. Because when Christianity became legal under Constantine, it adopted a new method of structuring itself. And that method of structuring generally adhered to a Roman understanding of gender norms that had not previously been dominant in the church's leadership. So women were gradually pushed more and more out of the ministry role until they were finally completely excluded from that, probably around the 6th or 7th century AD, which is kind of a tragedy, honestly. It's sad that the church pushed women out of ministry roles when it appears from the Bible and from tradition that they were intended to serve in those roles. But we can nonetheless see that in the early church, women did serve in ministry. Thank you very much for watching this video. Hope you have a blessed day. Thanks.